My brother shoved me out of my wheelchair. In front of our whole family, laughing as I hit the concrete, never knowing my surgeon stood behind him, ready to say 5 words that ended everything. The concrete hit my elbow first, then my hip, then my skull. Not hard enough to black out. Hard enough that the whole yard tilted sideways and stayed that way a second too long. 60 people stood in my Aunt Rosalind's backyard in Millhaven, Ohio, plates in hand, paper napkins tucked under lemonade cups. Phones came out before I even stopped moving. My brother Holden stood over me, breathing hard, his face red from 2 years of pretending he believed me. "Stop faking for attention," he said, loud enough for the whole yard to hear. "Get up, Ren." My wheelchair lay tipped on its side beside me, one wheel still spinning. My left leg had folded wrong underneath me on the way down. Pain shot up through my spine, the kind I'd spent 2 years learning to breathe through instead of screaming through. Nobody moved. Somebody near the cooler turned the music back up. "Get up," Holden said again, grinning out at the crowd like he'd told a joke everyone was waiting on. "She's been milking this wheelchair thing for 2 years off a fall nobody even saw happen," a voice near the fence called out. "I saw her walking around the Kroger on Delancey last month, fine as anything." Heads nodded around the patio. "Knew it," somebody muttered. Somebody else laughed. "I have physical therapy records," I said from the ground, my voice smaller than I wanted it. "There are medical files. You can call my surgeon right now." Holden kicked the frame of my chair. It rang out, metal on metal. "You've lived off Mom's spare room for 2 years, Ren. 2 years. Because I can't work a full shift standing," I said. "Because my leg gives out. Because you won't try," he snapped, and the crowd made a sound like they agreed with him. My Uncle Vaughn lifted his phone higher. "I'm recording this," he said, though I couldn't tell yet whose side he thought he was on. I searched the yard for one face that wasn't hard. My mother, Diane, stood by the picnic table, shredding a napkin into confetti, her mouth open like she wanted to say something and couldn't find where to start. My Aunt Rosalind stood with her arms crossed over her apron, watching like she'd already decided the ending. Holden crouched and yanked my wallet from the jacket pocket I kept it in for exactly this reason, so I'd never have to dig for it with my hand shaking. He held my disability card over his head like a trophy. $900 a month from the state, plus whatever Mom's covering on top of it. For what? The crowd clapped. Actually clapped. Like he'd landed a punchline and not just torn a wallet out of his sister's jacket while she lay on the ground. "Holden, that's enough," my mother said, but her voice came out thin. No weight behind it. The kind of thing you say because you're supposed to, and not because you think it'll work. He ignored her and turned back to me. "Stand up right now, or I'm calling the police on you myself. I'll report you for fraud." "I mean it. I can't," I whispered, and I hated how it sounded. How much it sounded like begging. Then somebody started it. A slow clap, then a chant. "Stand up, stand up, stand up." 50 voices, maybe, before I stopped counting, because counting was easier than listening to my own family. Holden grabbed a fistful of my shirt and hauled me halfway off the concrete. "I'm done watching you play this whole family for fools, you understand me? You're a liar and a— That's my patient, not yours." The chant died in the middle of a syllable. To understand how a spinal surgeon ended up standing behind my brother at exactly the right second, I need to go back 2 years, to a Tuesday in March that started out like any other Tuesday. I was 27. I worked as a claims coordinator for a regional insurance company in Millhaven, the kind of job where you spend all day reading other people's disasters and typing them into a database. Before that, I'd spent 4 years in the Ohio Army National Guard, mostly administrative work, one activation for flood relief down near Chillicothe. I liked paperwork. I liked things that could be proven with a document instead of an opinion. Hold on to that. It matters later. I was driving home from work at 5:40 in the evening on March 14th, stopped at the light at Route 9 in Delancey, when a box truck for a company called Renner Freight Logistics ran the red doing 41 miles an hour, according to the police report. He T-boned my driver's side door. I don't remember the impact. I remember the ceiling of the ambulance, and a paramedic named Cole telling me to stay awake, and thinking that was a strange thing to have to be told to do. I broke 3 vertebrae, L1 through L3, along with my pelvis and my left femur. I went through surgery 4 times over 6 weeks. My surgeon, Dr. Elias Marsh, placed the hardware still in my spine today. 4 titanium rods, 12 screws. I woke up from the last surgery, unable to fully feel my left leg below the knee, and he told me, plainly, without softening it, that the nerve damage might be permanent. It was. My father wasn't there for any of it. Thomas Callahan died of a heart attack when I was 12, and Holden was 17, working on a roof for his own remodeling job on a Saturday in October, gone before the ambulance even arrived. He ran a small contracting company, Callahan Builders, out of a shop behind our house. Holden inherited the tools, the truck, and some idea of himself as the man who had to hold the family together after that. He was 17. Nobody should have to hold anything together at 17, and I understood that about him for a long time. I understood it right up until the day he shoved me out of a wheelchair. Holden is 5 years older than me. Growing up, he was the brother who taught me to ride a bike in the church parking lot on Route 40, who threatened a kid in 7th grade for calling me a name I don't remember anymore, who drove 2 hours to bring me a care package when I was stationed at Camp Ravenna for a training rotation. I want to say that clearly because it matters for what comes next. He wasn't always cruel to me. He became something over time, and I think money is most of what he became it over. Callahan Builders didn't survive Holden running it. He wasn't a bad contractor exactly, he was a bad businessman. By the time I was in my mid-20s, he'd rebranded twice, first to Callahan Construction and Remodel, model, then quietly just to Holden's crew, whoever was available that month. He financed a shop expansion in 2021 that never paid for itself. He was 2 payments behind on that shop's mortgage the spring I got hit by the truck, a fact I only learned much later from paperwork I was never supposed to see. There was an earlier incident, 18 months before the accident, that I didn't understand the shape of until I looked back at it afterward. Our father had left Holden a 1987 Ford truck, the one he'd used for the business. More sentimental than valuable, but valuable enough. Holden sold it to a collector in Zanesville for $6,000 without telling anyone, and when I asked him about it at a 4th of July cookout, he told me he was holding on to the money for something, and that it was family money anyway, not really anybody's business. I let it go. It was his, technically. My father had left it to him by name in the will, but I remember the specific feeling I had that day, watching him deflect, watching him get annoyed that I'd even asked. It was the feeling of watching someone justify something to himself before he'd finished justifying it to you. When I enlisted in the Guard at 20, over our mother's quiet worry, Holden was the one who drove me to the recruiter's office in Millhaven and sat in the parking lot the whole time, in case I changed my mind and needed a ride home instead of a ride to basic training orientation. He didn't try to talk me out of it. He asked good questions instead, practical ones, about drill pay and tuition assistance, and what happened if I got activated during finals week. I remember thinking, at 20, that he'd make a good father someday, the kind who asks the boring logistical question instead of the emotional one, because the boring question is usually the one that actually helps. The relationship between us, before all of it, had been closer than most siblings I knew. He used to call me on my birthday every year without fail, even the year he was 2 weeks from a shop deadline and half asleep on his feet. He was the one who drove me to my Guard drill weekends when my car was in the shop, 6 months running, never once complaining about the 40-minute round trip. I bring this up not to excuse anything that came after, but because I think it matters, in a story like this, to be honest, that the villain didn't arrive fully formed. He was built slowly, out of a string of small financial panics he never told anyone about, each one making the next lie a little easier to tell himself. The lawsuit against Renner Freight Logistics settled 7 months after the accident for $410,000. I wasn't in a position to manage that money myself when it came through. I was still in a step-down rehab facility in Columbus, working on things like standing at a rail for 90 seconds without my leg buckling under me. The settlement was structured into a trust, administered through a company called Heartland Fiduciary Trust Services, with disbursements meant to cover my ongoing medical care, home modifications, and a monthly living stipend on top of my disability payment. Because I was still under a temporary incapacity determination when the money arrived, the probate court in Franklin County needed a trustee to manage disbursements on my behalf until I was formally cleared. My mother wasn't in a position to take it on. She'd never managed money beyond a checking account and a small pension from 30 years at the county clerk's office, and she said so, honestly, in front of the judge. Holden volunteered. He stood up in that courtroom in a blazer he'd clearly bought for the occasion and told the judge he'd put his sister's care above everything else, that family took care of family, that he understood construction budgets and could manage a trust account. The judge appointed him trustee, with a mandated review after 12 months. That review never happened. Holden filed for 2 extensions, citing ongoing complexity in the beneficiary's care needs. I didn't think much of it at the time. I was learning to walk on a fused spine. I did not have room in my life to interrogate my brother's paperwork, and I trusted him, in those early months, more than I've trusted almost anyone. He built the ramp himself that first autumn, without anyone asking him to. I remember standing at Mom's back door on a Saturday in October, 1 year to the week after my accident, watching him measure the slope twice before he cut a single board, the way our father used to. He worked through a light rain to finish it before I came home from a rehab appointment, and when I rolled up the driveway that evening, he was still out there in a soaked t-shirt, sanding down a rough edge on the handrail so it wouldn't catch on my palms. Dad would have made you test it before he called it done, he said, and made me roll up and down it 3 times while he watched, arms crossed, critical in the specific way that meant he cared. I believed, that night, that whatever else had changed about him, this part hadn't. I think I was right, that night. I think it stopped being true sometime in the year that followed, one invoice at a time, in a way neither of us could have pointed to on any single day. What I didn't know then, and wouldn't learn until much later from paperwork Marissa's team pulled, was that Holden's shop had gone 2 full mortgage cycles behind that same October, and that he'd taken out a short-term loan against a company vehicle to cover payroll for his one remaining employee. He never mentioned it. Not at Thanksgiving, not at Christmas, not once in the 18 months that followed, even as the number he owed grew large enough to swallow a settlement meant for somebody else's spine. I think about that ramp sometimes. I think he meant it, the night he built it. I also think a man can mean something completely, on a Saturday in October, and still spend the following year convincing himself he's owed a piece of what he's protecting. For the first several months, things were almost normal between us. He drove me to appointments. He helped Mom convert her downstairs office into a bedroom for me, since stairs were out of the question, at least officially. The guest room had always been upstairs, and Mom's house wasn't built with a first-floor bedroom in mind. He seemed, for a while, like the brother from the bike-riding care package years. The shift started small enough that I didn't clock it as a shift until much later. It started with him asking, more than once, in a tone that sounded almost curious, whether I thought I was leaning on the chair more than I needed to. It started with him telling Mom, not me, that he'd read an article about secondary gain in disability cases, about people who get attached to being taken care of. It started, if I'm honest with myself, around the same time his shop's second mortgage payment came due. By the 6-month mark, the pattern had a shape. Step 1 came in July, 16 months before the backyard, when my orthotics clinic submitted a claim to the trust for a new leg brace, custom molded $4,500, non-negotiable because insurance covered less than half. Holden didn't deny it. He didn't approve it either. He told the clinic the trust was under review for the quarter and asked them to resubmit in 90 days. I paid the difference myself, out of savings I'd built back up doing claims intake for my old company 2 days a week. It cost me $1,100 I didn't love losing. I told myself it was a bureaucratic hiccup. Trusts have paperwork. I understood paperwork. Step 2 came at Thanksgiving that year. We were at Mom's table, 14 people, and Holden brought up, unprompted, that he'd seen me get up from the couch that morning to answer the door without my chair. "You were up and walking fine this morning," he said to the whole table, not to me. Just saying. I explained again the way I'd explained a dozen times, that my leg works in short bursts on flat ground and fails without warning on stairs, on uneven surfaces, or after sitting too long, that the nerve damage was permanent and documented, that walking sometimes and disabled are not opposites. My mother nodded along, but I watched her file something away that day. I watched her start believing there might be 2 versions of the story, mine and Holden's, both worth weighing, instead of one story and one lie. Step 3, in February, was the home health aid. The trust had been paying for a caregiver named Priya to come 3 mornings a week, helping with the exercises Dr. Marsh's physical therapist had prescribed, helping with things that require 2 working hips more than mine currently have. Holden cut it to 1 morning a week, telling me the trust's caregiving allocation had been running hot and needed to be brought back in line with projections. 3 weeks later, I watched him pull into Mom's driveway in a brand new Ford F-250, the kind of truck that runs close to $60,000 before tax, and he told everyone at dinner that an old client finally paid off a job from 2 years back. I didn't say anything that night. I wrote the date down in the Notes app on my phone instead. February 19th, new truck, old client, allegedly. I didn't know yet what I was building. I just knew I wanted it written down. There was a step in between, one I didn't recognize as a step at the time, only as a bad night. In March, a month after the truck showed up in Mom's driveway, Holden and I argued over the caregiving cut. The first time I'd pushed back on him directly instead of just absorbing it. He didn't raise his voice. That was almost worse. He told me, very calmly, that if the trust couldn't sustainably cover in-home care, the responsible thing might be to look into a facility with a lower overhead, somewhere licensed, somewhere with staff instead of a rotating aide he had to schedule around. I told him I wasn't leaving Mom's house. He shrugged and said the trust was his to manage in my best interest, and that sometimes the person receiving care isn't the best judge of what that care should look like. I remember sitting with that sentence for a long time after he left. Sometimes the person receiving care isn't the best judge. I had spent 4 years reading insurance files where sentences like that one showed up right before something got taken away from somebody. I didn't know yet that it was happening to me. I only knew the sentence didn't sound like my brother. It sounded like a man rehearsing a justification he'd need later to someone other than me. Step 4 was the mail. In April, a year and 4 months after the accident, a year-end statement from Heartland Fiduciary Trust Services arrived at Mom's address instead of Holden's apartment. A mailing error the trust company later admitted to and apologized for in writing. My mother, not thinking anything of it, set it on the kitchen counter with the rest of the mail, and I picked it up along with a coupon flyer, thinking it might be something of mine. It wasn't addressed to me. It was addressed to Holden Callahan, trustee, and it was a full-year accounting of disbursements from my own trust. Most of it was ordinary: medical bills, co-pays, my monthly stipend, $700, direct deposited like clockwork, which I want to be fair and say he never touched. But near the bottom, under a line item labeled medical equipment and home modification, was a withdrawal for $40,000, dated February 12th, 1 week before the truck. The description read, wheelchair accessible van modification, vendor payment. I don't own a van. I have never owned a van. I ride in the backseat of my mother's 12-year-old Honda Odyssey, unmodified, the same way I have for 2 years, folding my chair into the trunk myself when nobody's around to help, because asking for help too often is its own kind of exhausting. I sat at that kitchen counter for a long time with that statement in my lap, reading the same line over and over, waiting for it to add up to something other than what it obviously was. Quick pause from the story. If you enjoy these stories, consider taking a listen to our Spotify show, linked in the description, for early access to new stories in better audio quality. Now back to the video. I didn't confront him that night. I've thought a lot since about why. Part of it was that I still, even then, wanted an explanation that didn't require me to lose my brother. Part of it was that I understood, from 4 years of doing exactly this kind of work for an insurance company, that the worst thing you can do with evidence is show your hand before you understand what you're holding. So I photographed every page of that statement with my phone before my mother could find it again and hand it straight to Holden, tipping him off. I put the originals back exactly where they'd been. Then I started asking careful, boring, paperwork-shaped questions, the kind that don't sound like accusations. I called Heartland Fiduciary direct correctly, using my own name as the beneficiary, and asked politely for a general breakdown of disbursement categories over the life of the trust, something I was legally entitled to request even without trustee approval, a fact I only knew because of my claims background. It took 3 weeks and 2 follow-up calls to get a call back from a case manager named Denise, who told me, careful and a little too neutral, that she wasn't able to discuss specific vendor relationships, but that beneficiaries had a right to request a full accounting through the appointing court if they had concerns about trustee conduct. That phrase sat with me for days. Concerns about trustee conduct. Step 5 happened in June, 6 weeks before the backyard, and it was the one that finally moved this from a worry into a plan. Priya, my one remaining morning of caregiving, mentioned in passing that she worked for an agency called Comfort Care Home Health, and that her supervisor there was a guy named Marcus, and that Marcus and my brother went way back, roommates in college or something. I didn't say anything. I went home and looked up Ohio's business filings that night, the kind of public record search anyone can run for free if they know where to click, and found that Comfort Care Home Health LLC had been registered 14 months earlier by a Marcus T. Feld at an address that, when I looked closer, turned out to be a UPS store mailbox in Millhaven, not an actual office. Caregiving companies build trusts by the visit, by the hour, sometimes with a management fee layered on top for coordination. If Marcus was billing the trust for caregiving hours that weren't happening, Priya was real. Priya's hours were real, but Priya wasn't the only aide listed, according to a partial invoice that made its way to Mom's counter by accident a few weeks later. Then somebody was collecting money for care that was never delivered, and if that somebody was splitting it with the trustee who'd hired the agency in the first place, that was no longer a bureaucratic hiccup. That was theft, dressed up in invoices with a letterhead. I hired an attorney on June 30th. Her name was Marissa Odom, a probate litigator 2 towns over who didn't know my family and had no reason to soften anything for me. I brought her the photographed statement, the notes app entry about the truck, the business filing for Comfort Care, and the partial invoice. She looked through all of it in about 20 minutes and told me, flatly, that she thought I had enough to file an emergency petition for an accounting and a temporary suspension of trustee authority, but that it would take time to get in front of a judge, and that Franklin County's probate docket moved slower than either of us would like. We filed on July 9th. The petition asked the court to freeze further disbursements pending a full audit, to order Holden to produce 2 years of trust records, and to appoint a professional fiduciary in his place while the audit was underway. Marissa told me a hearing would likely be scheduled within 4 to 6 weeks, and that petitions like this were rarely fast, no matter how strong the paperwork behind them was. The reunion at Aunt Rosalind's was scheduled for August 2nd, 24 days after we filed. I asked Dr. Marsh, separately in early July, if he'd be willing to put together an updated letter for the court, summarizing my diagnosis, prognosis, and ongoing care needs in plain medical language a probate judge could understand without a translator. He said he would. He also mentioned, almost as an afterthought, that he had a conference in Columbus the first week of August and could drop the signed letter off in person on his way through Millhaven, rather than mailing it and losing a week. I told him where the reunion was being held, mostly so he'd know where to find me that Saturday if he came by in the early afternoon like he said he might. I didn't ask him to come as a witness. I want to be honest about that. I asked him to come because it was efficient, because I needed a signature on a document that mattered to a judge I'd never met. Everything else that happened that day was Holden's doing, not mine, and not luck either. Not really. It was 2 years of a man believing nobody was keeping records, walking straight into a yard where, for once, somebody was. The call from Marissa came on July 30th, a Thursday, 2 days before the reunion. Holden's attorney had reached out to hers that morning, requesting a meeting to discuss resolution before this proceeds further, which is a lawyer's way of saying his client had just been served and panicked. Marissa told me, carefully, that being served doesn't usually change someone's behavior for the better in cases like this. Sometimes it makes people generous, eager to settle quietly. Sometimes it makes them dangerous in a different way, desperate to control the narrative before the paperwork gets the chance to control it for them. I didn't think much of the warning at the time. I thought I understood my brother's temper. I didn't understand, not yet, what a man does with 2 days and a room full of relatives who already half believed him. Marissa also had news from the forensic accountant she'd brought on, a woman named Priya Anand, no relation to my caregiver, an odd coincidence that made me laugh for the first time in weeks when I heard it. The accountant's preliminary review, based on the records the trust company could release without Holden's sign-off, put the total in fraudulent or unexplained disbursements at $84,000 over roughly 20 months. $61,400 of it had run through Comfort Care Home Health, billed for caregiving visits on days when my Priya had documentation showing she wasn't scheduled, wasn't paid by Comfort Care for those hours, and in several cases wasn't even in the state, visiting her sister in Michigan. The remaining $22,600 ran through direct withdrawals coded as administrative fees and equipment purchases, including the $40,000 van modification that never happened to a van I didn't own. I almost didn't file in June, before any of this. I sat in Marissa's office on the day of our first consultation, with the printed statement in my lap, and told her I wasn't sure I wanted to go through with a petition at all, that maybe there was a version of this where I just quietly asked Holden to step down as trustee, no court, no record, no family fallout. out. Marissa didn't push. She told me instead about a case she'd handled 2 years earlier, a different family, a different trustee, where the beneficiary had asked quietly and been told just as quietly that everything was fine, and 18 months later there was nothing left to recover. Quiet doesn't protect you, she said. It just delays the part where you find out, and usually makes that part more expensive. I signed the retainer that afternoon, right there in her office, before I could talk myself back into being quiet. I've thought about that sentence more times than I can count since. Marissa read me the numbers over the phone in the same flat voice she used for everything, and I sat on the edge of my bed in Mom's converted office and did the math a claims coordinator does instinctively, without meaning to. $84,000 was roughly the difference between a shop mortgage that gets paid off early and one that limps along for another decade. It was almost exactly the price of a new Ford F-250, financed, plus back payments on a commercial lease I later learned he'd fallen behind on twice. It wasn't cruelty for its own sake in the end. I want to say that clearly, because I think it's the truer and sadder version of the story. It was a man in financial trouble who'd convinced himself the money was his to borrow, the same way he'd convinced himself $6,000 from a dead man's truck was family money, not really anybody's business. He needed a story where I didn't really need the care he was billing for, because if I was faking my recovery, then it followed, in whatever logic he'd built for himself at 3 in the morning over unpaid invoices, that the caregiving hours hadn't really mattered either, that the money hadn't really been stolen from someone who needed it, that he was, in some twisted accounting only he could balance, not really a thief. The reunion wasn't an accident of temper. I understood that now, sitting on the edge of that bed with Marissa's number still ringing in my ear. Holden had 2 days to decide what to do with a lawsuit that could end his business, expose him to a criminal referral, and confirm to every relative in that backyard that he was capable of stealing from his own sister's spinal cord injury. He chose to get in front of it the only way he knew how to fight, the way he'd always fought, by making noise loud enough that nobody stopped to check whether it was true. If he could get 60 relatives to believe I was a liar and a fraud before the hearing, then whatever came out of that courtroom would look to everyone who mattered to him like the last gasp of a jealous, lazy little sister trying to take him down out of spite. He wasn't wrong that public opinion matters. He was wrong about which direction it was going to move. I went to that reunion on August 2nd knowing I was walking into whatever he'd planned. I didn't know it would be a shove out of my own wheelchair in front of 60 people. I didn't know Dr. Marsh's timing would land exactly where it did, coffee still steaming in his hand, walking up the driveway at the worst possible moment for my brother and the best possible moment for the truth. I only knew I wasn't going to cancel, and I wasn't going to hide, and I had a folder of my own sitting in Marissa's office with my brother's name on it, waiting for a hearing date that was now 3 weeks away. "Who are you?" Holden demanded, letting go of my shirt so fast I dropped the last few inches back to the stone. Dr. Marsh took a slow sip of the gas station coffee in his hand before he answered, like a man who had absolutely nowhere else more urgent to be. "Dr. Elias Marsh," he said. "I performed Wren's spinal fusion at Fairview Orthopedic. I've treated her for 28 months, since 40 hours after her accident." The yard had gone fully silent, the kind of silence that has weight to it. My Aunt Rosalind found her voice first, high and a little too bright. "Well, doctor, forgive me, but she walks just fine when nobody's watching her." Dr. Marsh smiled at her, and it didn't reach anywhere near his eyes. He held up his phone, already unlocked, already on the screen he wanted. An X-ray filled the display, pale bone and brighter hardware. 4 titanium rods, he said. 12 screws, placed 16 months ago, after 2 prior surgeries failed to fully stabilize the fracture site. He swiped. A different scan appeared. "Her sciatic nerve here. Permanent damage confirmed by 3 separate specialists, including one your family hired independently for a second opinion 2 years ago, which also came back consistent with mine." He looked up. "Her leg gives out with no warning. That's very likely what happened on the stairs at the shop 18 months ago. When she spent 6 weeks in a boot for a fall, nobody blamed her for then. And it's exactly what happened just now, on flat concrete, in front of all of you. Nobody near the fence was drifting toward the house anymore. They'd stopped. Her leg brace costs $4,500, Dr. Marsh went on, conversational, almost gentle, which somehow made it land harder than shouting would have. "There is no cure for what she has. There's management. There's therapy. There's a lifetime of it." He turned finally to look straight at Holden. "But sure, let's go with faking it." He raised the phone a second time, and this time he pressed play instead of swiping. Holden's own voice came out of the speaker, tinny but unmistakable. "Stop faking for attention. Get up, Wren." Then the sound of my elbow, my hip, my skull, hitting stone in sequence. Then the laughter. Then, worse than anything else, the chant, 50 voices strong, playing back to the same 50 people who had made it. "I started recording the moment I came through that gate," Dr. A. Marsh said, once the clip ran out. "I heard the tail end of it from the driveway. Wren didn't ask me to. I did it because I've been an orthopedic surgeon for 19 years, and I have never once had a patient's own family stage an assault in a backyard before I could even get my coffee." He glanced at my uncle. "You're not the only one who thought to record today, sir." Uncle Vaughn lowered his phone about 2 inches, like he suddenly wasn't sure what he'd caught on it, or which side of it he was going to end up on. Holden's face had gone the color of the concrete I was still half sitting on. "Everybody thought," he started, reaching for the yard, for the 50 voices, for the version of events where he still had the room. "You didn't think at all," Dr. Marsh said, cutting him off without without raising his voice, which was somehow worse than if he had. 2 years, and you never once asked a single question you didn't already have the answer you wanted for. It was easier to decide she was lying than to sit with what actually happened to her. I pulled myself up onto one forearm on the stone. My whole left side had gone hot and numb in that specific way that meant it would be agony in about 10 minutes, once the adrenaline wore off, but I wasn't done yet, and I wasn't going to say what I needed to say from flat on my back. You want to know why I have a lawyer, Holden? I said. My voice came out steadier than I expected. It's not because I want your money. It's because I found the statement. April, $40,000 for a van modification on a van I don't own. I know about Comfort Care. I know about Marcus. I know Priya was in Michigan on 6 of the days you billed the trust for her hours. I watched something behind his eyes go from anger to something closer to panic. Fast, the way water changes right before it starts to boil. We filed a petition 3 weeks ago, I said. You got served Thursday. That's why today happened the way it happened. You didn't lose your temper in front of our whole family, Holden. You planned it. You needed everybody in this yard to think I was a liar before a judge ever got the chance to think you were a thief. That's not, he started. It's true, Holden. My mother's voice cut in from somewhere behind me, and I twisted to see her standing closer than I'd realized, the shredded napkin still in her fist. I saw the truck. I saw it, and I didn't ask either because it was easier not to. She wasn't looking at me when she said it. She was looking at him, and something in her face had gone very still, the way a person looks right before a decision finishes making itself. My cousin Devin, standing near the drink table with a paper plate he'd forgotten he was holding, said, quiet enough that I almost missed it, she really has a lawyer? Nobody answered him. Nobody needed to. I need you to hear this part, I said, and something in how I said it made even Rosalind go quiet. You didn't just take money that was supposed to keep me walking. You made me spend 2 years convincing our own mother I wasn't lying about my own body. That's the part I don't think I'll ever get back. No matter what happens in that courtroom, I can get the money back. I don't think I get that back. Dr. Marsh crouched beside me, professional again, checking my pupils, my grip, running through whatever silent list a surgeon runs through when his patient has just hit concrete twice as hard as she should have. Can you move your toes for me, Ren? I could. Barely, and it hurt in a way that made my eyes sting, but I could. Bring her chair, he said to the yard. Not to anyone in particular, and for one long second nobody moved, the way nobody had moved when it mattered the first time. Then my mother crossed the patio at something close to a run, tears cutting clean tracks through 2 hours of makeup, and righted my wheelchair, and rolled it over herself instead of waiting for someone else to. Dr. Marsh helped lift me into the seat. Then he stood and faced the rest of the yard. 60 people who had 10 minutes earlier chanted at a woman on the ground. I came today because Ren's attorney asked for updated documentation for a court hearing, he said. I came early because I had a coffee craving and bad traffic timing. I did not come to stage a scene. Your family did that part all on its own. He set a business card down on the picnic table, square in the middle of it, the way you'd set down a winning hand. My attorney's contact information for anyone who wants to verify anything I've said today, instead of just deciding whether they like it. He looked at Holden one more time. I'm also filing a police report tomorrow morning. Ren served 4 years in the Ohio Army National Guard. Assault against a disabled veteran carries enhanced penalties in this state. You should talk to your lawyer about that too, on top of everything else your lawyer's about to be dealing with. Holden's face had gone past white into something closer to gray. Dr. Marsh took the handles of my chair. We're leaving. She needs to be seen at an emergency room, and I'd rather be the one driving her there. Holden came after us across the lawn, past the picnic table, past the card he hadn't picked up. Ren, wait, I'm sorry, I didn't mean. I looked back at my brother from the wheelchair he'd tipped me out of 20 minutes earlier. You never asked, I said. Not once, in 2 years. That's the whole thing, Holden. You never asked. Dr. Marsh wheeled me around the side of the house to the driveway, loaded my chair into the back of his SUV, and pulled out onto Delancey Street. I watched my brother shrink in the side mirror, standing alone in the middle of that lawn full of people who were, for the first time in 2 years, looking at him instead of at me. The emergency room at Fairview General kept me 4 hours. Nothing was broken that hadn't already been broken and fused before. The impact had inflamed the nerve pathway along my hip, which meant a week of pain that made even the fused parts of my spine feel like they were arguing with each other. Dr. Marsh stayed for the first hour, not because he had to, filling out incident documentation for the radiologist that I'd later learn he didn't need to personally handle, but did anyway. My phone started buzzing before we even left the ER waiting room. Not from Holden, from nearly everyone else. My cousin Devin, Rosalind's oldest, texted first. Are you okay? I'm so sorry. I didn't say anything and I should have. My Aunt Rosalind called twice and left one voicemail, her voice cracking through most of it, saying she'd believed the story that was easiest instead of the one that was true, and that she was sorry, and that she'd meant what she said about being at the courthouse for the hearing if I wanted her there. Uncle Vaughn sent the video, uncropped, unedited, the whole 11 minutes of it, to the family group chat with a single line of text. Everyone needs to see the whole thing, not just the part they want to remember. The video moved through that group chat like a fever breaking. By Sunday morning, it had reached relatives 3 branches removed who I hadn't spoken to in years. People who called Mom directly, people who called me directly, most of them landing somewhere between horrified and ashamed. A few didn't. My father's older brother, my Uncle Gary, called to tell me he thought I was milking the sympathy angle even now, and and that families should handle things privately instead of airing it out for views, a comment that would have stung more if I'd had any energy left to spend on it. I let that call go to voicemail and never called him back. Not every relationship survives a moment like that one, and I've made peace with the fact that a few of mine didn't need to. Priya called me that Sunday too, off the clock, just to check on me, and told me something I hadn't known. She'd almost quit the agency 6 months earlier over a scheduling discrepancy she'd flagged to Marcus directly. Hours logged under her name for a visit she never made. He'd told her it was a system error, apologized, fixed it in the log she could see. She hadn't thought about it again until the reunion story reached her through a mutual friend. I should have pushed harder, she told me. I didn't want to lose the client. I told her she had nothing to apologize for. She wasn't the one who built the scheme. She was just the only honest name inside it. Holden made his desperate moves over the following 10 days, and they were exactly the moves you'd expect from a man watching 2 years of a story collapse at once. He showed up at Mom's house on Monday evening, 3 days after the reunion, while I was icing my hip on the living room couch, and asked to talk to her alone in the kitchen. I heard most of it anyway, because Mom's house isn't large and I wasn't about to leave the room. He told her the petition was Marissa twisting the numbers, that Comfort Care was a legitimate vendor with some clerical issues, that the truck was financed through a dealership, not the trust, and that he could get paperwork to prove it if she just gave him a little time. Show me the paperwork now then, my mother said, and I heard something in her voice I hadn't heard directed at Holden in 2 years. Not doubt aimed at me, doubt aimed at him. He didn't have it with him. He said he'd bring it Thursday. Thursday came and went. On Wednesday, Marissa called to tell me Holden had attempted to transfer the remaining trust balance, just under $90,000, into a new account at a different bank, a move his own trust agreement technically still permitted him to make until the court order came through, since the temporary trustee suspension hadn't been finalized yet. The transfer got flagged by Heartland Fiduciary's internal compliance team before it cleared, an automatic hold triggered by the size of the withdrawal relative to recent activity, and it bought us 3 additional days that turned out to matter enormously. On Thursday, instead of paperwork, Holden called our mother and asked her for $8,000, framing it as a loan against her retirement account, to cover a shortfall before the hearing, a request so transparent in its desperation that even she, who had spent 2 years giving him the benefit of every doubt she had left, said no. Somewhere in that same stretch of days, Holden posted a long message to the family group chat, the same one Uncle Vaughn's video had already moved through twice, claiming the footage had been clipped and rearranged to make it look worse, that the full context showed me provoking him, that he had his own recording that told a different story. He never produced one. Devin, of everyone, was the one who called him on it directly, in the same group chat, asking him to just post his version if it existed, since Vaughn's file still had its original timestamp and metadata intact, and anyone could check it. Holden left the group chat 2 hours later instead of answering. I didn't celebrate that. I remember feeling mostly tired, the specific tired that comes from watching someone you used to trust run out of moves in real time, in front of an audience, one more time. The emergency hearing landed on August 14th, 12 days after the reunion, faster than Marissa had originally predicted, in part because the attempted transfer became its own piece of evidence for urgency. I couldn't sit through most of it in person. The drive alone was enough to leave my hips screaming by the time we parked, and I ended up in a hallway chair outside the courtroom for the first hour, my mother beside me, both of us listening through the door as best we could. The judge, a woman named Patricia Okonkwo-Reyes, granted the emergency petition in full, immediate suspension of Holden as trustee, a full forensic accounting of 2 years of disbursements, at his expense, a temporary asset freeze on the remaining trust balance and on personal accounts tied to the improper withdrawals, pending the outcome of the audit, appointment of Heartland's own senior fiduciary officer as interim trustee, with instructions to immediately reinstate my full caregiving schedule and process the leg brace claim that had been sitting in limbo for over a year. Marissa told me afterward that Judge Okonkwo-Reyes had looked directly at Holden's attorney while reading the order, not at the paperwork, and said, before moving on to the next case on her docket, that a 2-year pattern of restricting a disabled beneficiary's care while simultaneously financing a personal vehicle was not the kind of ambiguity this court needs a full trial to resolve. She wasn't required to say that on the record. Marissa thought she'd said it anyway because she wanted it in the transcript, in case anyone downstream ever wondered how obvious it had looked from the bench. I was in the emergency room again that afternoon, not for anything dramatic this time, just a follow-up scan Dr. Marsh had ordered after the fall to check the hardware in my spine when the call came through from a Franklin County number I didn't recognize. I almost let it go to voicemail. I'd had enough of unknown numbers for 1 month. I answered on the 4th ring, in a hospital hallway that smelled like antiseptic and burnt coffee, and a clerk from the probate court identified herself and said 4 words before anything else. The judge granted it. I sat down hard on the plastic bench along the wall, my whole chest going tight in that specific way it does right before either crying or laughing, and for a second I genuinely didn't know which one was coming. It was relief in the end, though it took the shape of tears the way relief sometimes does when it arrives at the end of something long enough. I called Marissa back within the hour to get the details in full, but that clerk's 4 words were the ones that actually landed, the ones I'd remember specifically, the way you remember the exact wording of the news that changes something, whether the news is good or bad. The criminal side moved slower and less cleanly. The county prosecutor's office, working off the forensic accountant's final report in October, declined to pursue felony theft charges against Holden directly, citing the difficulty of proving intent beyond a reasonable doubt for a case this document-heavy, but did file charges against Marcus Feld for the Comfort Care invoices, which were more straightforwardly fraudulent on their face. Holden avoided prison. He did not avoid the civil judgment that came out of the probate case, ordering him to repay the full $84,000, plus interest, to the trust, a debt that will follow him for years given what I know of his finances. He lost the business almost immediately after. 2 remaining clients pulled their contracts within a month of the story, reaching enough of Millhaven's small business circle, which it inevitably did, because Millhaven is the kind of town where everyone's cousin knows everyone's cousin. There were unexpected allies in all of it, people I hadn't counted on. Uncle Vaughn, of all people, ended up being one of the more useful witnesses in the probate hearing, since his uncropped video became part of the evidentiary record showing the coordinated nature of the confrontation. He drove me to 2 follow-up appointments that fall, without being asked, and never once brought up the fact that he'd once stood there with his phone raised, unsure which side he was on. I never brought it up either. Some apologies are better shown than said, and his showed up as a Honda idling in Mom's driveway at 8 in the morning, 3 separate times, no explanation offered or needed. Aunt Rosalind showed up at the second hearing date in September, sitting in the row behind us, and afterward asked if she could take me to lunch, just the 2 of us, something we hadn't done in years. She spent most of that lunch apologizing in a dozen small specific ways instead of one big general one, which I've come to think is the more honest kind of apology. She remembered, unprompted, the exact words she'd said in that backyard. She walks just fine when nobody's watching her. She said she thought about that sentence more than she wanted to admit, turning it over, trying to figure out how she'd let herself say something so certain about a body that wasn't hers to be certain about. I think I wanted it to be true, she told me, over a plate of food neither of us finished. If you were faking, none of it was really that sad. It was just a story with a villain in it who wasn't anyone I loved. I understood what she meant, even as it stung to hear out loud. It's easier to believe a stranger's lie than a family member's tragedy, because the lie asks nothing of you, and the tragedy asks you to sit with something you can't fix. I told her I forgave her for the sentence in the backyard. I meant it mostly. I've learned forgiveness doesn't have to be total to be real. It just has to be honest about what it does and doesn't cover. My closest friend from my old unit, a woman named Bethan I'd served alongside during the flood relief activation, drove 3 hours from Dayton the weekend after the reunion, uninvited, with a cooler of groceries and a folding ramp mat she'd found online in case Mom's driveway needed backup. She didn't ask for details right away. She just made dinner in my mother's kitchen and let me talk when I was ready to, which turned out to be somewhere around 10 that night, sitting on the back steps looking at the ramp Holden had built 2 years earlier, the one I still used every single day regardless of anything else that was true about him. Bethan listened to the whole thing without interrupting, and when I finished, she said the only thing that actually helped that week, which was that she wasn't surprised I'd built a case instead of a breakdown. That's just who you are, she said. You'd have made a hell of an investigator even before any of this. I hadn't cried yet, through any of it, not really. I cried then, on the back steps, with someone who'd known me before the truck, before the trust, before any of it, and it felt less like falling apart, and more like finally being allowed to. The grief came later than I expected it to, and quieter. It hit me hardest on an ordinary Tuesday in October, not during any of the hearings, not during any of the calls. I was going through an old box of photos with my mother, helping her sort out what to keep for a scrapbook she'd started and never finished, and I found a picture of Holden at 19, teaching me to ride a bike in the gravel lot behind Millhaven Baptist, one hand on the back of my banana seat, both of us laughing at something outside the frame. I sat with that photo for a long time. I wasn't angry looking at it. I was just sad, in the specific, unglamorous way that has nothing to do with forgiveness and everything to do with math. The years he'd been that brother versus the years he'd been the other one, and how the second number had grown so much larger than the first that it had swallowed most of my memory of him whole. I let myself feel that, and then I put the photo back in the box, and I helped my mother finish the scrapbook without him in most of the later pages, because that's simply where the true version of the story had landed. It's been 6 months since that reunion. I still live in my mother's converted downstairs office, though we've started talking, seriously now, about a small ranch-style rental with a 0-step entry that the increased trust disbursements would actually let me afford on my own by spring. My leg brace arrived in September, $4,500, paid without a single follow-up call required. Priya is back to 3 mornings a week, plus a 4th I added myself, paid for out of my own restored stipend, because I decided I wanted the extra help, and for the first time in 2 years, nobody had to approve that decision but me. The interim fiduciary at Heartland turned out to be a careful, unglamorous woman named Carol, who emails me a plain, boring spreadsheet every month, and I have never in my life been so relieved by a spreadsheet. I read every line of it. Old habits. My mother and I are better than we were, though it took longer to rebuild than the trust paperwork did. She said sorry to me more times than I've asked her to, and I've told her more than once that I understand how a person believes the version of events that costs them the least, right up until it costs them everything. I don't think she'll make that mistake again, with me or with anyone. I watch her now, at family gatherings, ask more questions than she used to. That's its own kind of repair, even even if it came late. I went back to work in November, 4 days a week now instead of 2. Back at the same regional insurer, the same disaster reading job that taught me how to read a trust statement like it owed me an explanation. My supervisor asked gently if I wanted to move into their claims investigation unit once a position opened up in the spring. I told her yes before she finished the sentence. There's a kind of justice in that, I think, small and unglamorous. A woman who spent 2 years being told she didn't understand her own body, now spending her working hours proving, line by line, whether other people's stories hold up. The rental with the zero-step entry closed on a lease in February. $1,100 a month, 2 bedrooms, a driveway wide enough for a chair to turn around in without scraping a fender. I move in at the end of this month. My mother cried when I told her, and then apologized for crying, and then admitted she was proud of the crying too. Both things true at once, the way most things about this year have been. I haven't spoken to Holden since the driveway. He's tried twice through text messages I read and didn't answer. Both of them some version of an apology that mentioned his own hardship more than mine. I don't hate him. I want to be honest about that too, because I think the clean version of the story, the one where I hate him completely and simply, would be easier to tell and less true. Hate would be simpler to carry into a new apartment. It would fit in fewer boxes. What I have instead is heavier and harder to name, something closer to mourning a man who is still, technically, alive and reachable by text message, just no longer someone I recognize enough to want reached. I loved my brother. I loved the version of him that taught me to ride a bike and drove 2 hours with a care package, and stood between me and a cruel 7th grader before I even knew I needed defending. That version of him is gone. Or maybe he was never quite as solid as I remember him, and what happened after our father died just wore him down to whoever was underneath the whole time. Either way, I lost him twice. Once slowly, over 2 years of small cruelties I kept explaining away, and once completely, in a backyard in front of 60 people. I don't think I get either version of him back, and I've stopped waiting to. Dr. Marsh still sees me every 4 months for follow-up scans. He never brings up that day unless I do. When I finally thanked him properly, months later, for the timing of his visit, for the phone in his hand, for the 5 words he said before anything else that day, he told me he hadn't planned any of it either. He'd just refused to let a room full of people decide the truth by volume instead of by evidence, which is, I've come to think, the closest thing to a thesis this whole story has. I asked him once, at a follow-up in November, why he'd bothered recording anything at all, given that he barely knew our family and had every reason to just hand me the letter and drive on to his conference. He thought about it for a second, the way he thinks about everything, unhurried, like there's no version of a rushed answer that's worth giving. You'd told me months earlier that nobody in your family had ever asked to see your scans, he said. I remembered that. I figured if the day ever came when they finally looked, I wanted to make sure they had something worth looking at. I don't know that I've ever been given a kinder piece of foresight by someone who owed me nothing, and I don't expect to be given one quite like it again. That's the part I keep coming back to. More than the money, more than the judgment, more than even the apology I never got. It was never really about whether I could walk to the mailbox on a good day. It was about whether the people who loved me were willing to ask a real question before they believed a convenient answer. Most of my family failed that test for 2 years. A surgeon who'd known me for 28 months passed it in about 4 seconds, with a phone already recording and a 5-word sentence he didn't have to plan. Some nights I still run the numbers, out of habit more than need. $84,000, 20 months, 60 people in a backyard. 5 words from a man I'd known for 28 months, against 2 years of silence from people I'd known my whole life. None of it balances the way I want it to, not even now, with the trust restored and the rental lease signed and the brace paid for without a single phone call. Some accounts just don't close clean. I've stopped expecting this one to. I still think about the sound my elbow made against that concrete sometimes more than I'd like to. I think, more often, about the silence right after it. 60 people standing in a yard, deciding all at once what kind of family they wanted to be. Most of them chose better eventually. Some of them chose it too late for it to mean what it might have meant a year earlier, and I've made my peace with that too. The way you make peace with anything that costs you something real and doesn't give the whole thing back. My brother shoved me out of my wheelchair in front of our whole family. He never knew my surgeon was standing right behind him. He never asked. That was always the whole problem. Long before that Saturday in August, and it's the only ending this story was ever going to have. Not a clean ending. Not a happy one exactly. Just an honest one, which, after 2 years of the other kind, was more than enough.